Hey everybody, welcome to my review of Solasta, Crown of the Magister, Palace of Ice. My previous review video on Solasta was focused solely on the base game, with none of the DLC. This video, however, will be focused on my experience with the Palace of Ice campaign, with all of the currently available content DLC that Solasta has to offer, such as Primal Calling, Inner Strength, and Lost Valley. And you can watch all of my gameplay of the Palace of Ice DLC on this channel in an 11-episode, edited down, Let's Play format. So starting off with my general thoughts on the Palace of Ice DLC and what it brings to the table, I would say that my overall impressions are mostly positive, in the sense that if you liked what you got from the base game of Crown of the Magister, then you'll probably enjoy Palace of Ice, as it's basically more of the same. If you didn't enjoy Crown of the Magister, then I'm afraid this DLC, or any of the other DLC, is probably not going to change your mind about the game. Palace of Ice is a direct sequel to the Crown of the Magister campaign, and helps tie up some of the not-so-subtle cliffhangers from the original plotline. It even allows you to import your characters from your Crown of the Magister save files, and they will come into a new story with all of their old gear, class levels, and whatever else was in your character's inventory, which is always a nice touch. The Palace of Ice campaign also raises the max level from 12 to 16, so you can expect to see a continuation of your character's progression, gaining higher level spells, more class features, and even better equipment. But just in case you deleted your old save files, or if you wanted to play with new characters, the Palace of Ice campaign also does allow you to start fresh, and will boost characters all the way to level 10 at the beginning of the campaign, and it also supplies your new party with some pretty powerful gear, so that you can progress through the story without getting smacked around with every combat encounter. However, it will still be a little bit awkward for new character story-wise, since there will be many references to your party sealing the rift and being saviors of Solasta due to past events, because the game will pretend as if your characters finished the Crown of the Magister campaign, even if you didn't. But all in all, as someone who very much enjoys D&D, RPGs, and turn-based strategy games, I would say that Palace of Ice is a fairly solid addition to the world of Solasta, as it has some cool new monsters to fight, some challenging combat, and a few ways for you to interact with some of the story elements, giving the player a few more choices in how they respond to certain events, and seeing the consequences of their actions, which helps Solasta feel more like an RPG, which is a nice improvement over the cut-and-dry linear story that Crown of the Magister offered. And speaking of story, I want to go over the premise of the main storyline of Palace of Ice in a non-spoilery fashion, while dedicating the end of the video for going over the more specific details of the main campaign that may contain some spoilers for the plot. The Palace of Ice campaign starts us off with a brief montage recap episode to jog your memories of what happened in the Crown of Magister campaign, with your main characters beating back the hordes of otherworldly evil lizards known as Sorax, and sealing the rift that would have brought their dark god Sortar over to Solasta by using the magic of the fully empowered Crown of the Magister with all of its gems. Your merry band of 4 adventurers that were once mere deputies of the Legacy Council are now hailed as proper heroes, but of course, as always, trouble lurks just around the corner. As your party makes their way over to a temple at the request of your old paladin friend, Marshal Sunblaze, you are attacked by some well-armed bandits. After defeating the bandits, your party realizes that your assailants were in fact mercenaries hired by Galvan to try and murder the heroes of Solasta. Once your party arrives at the temple and meets up with Marshal Sunblaze, the situation is revealed to be much more dire than was originally thought. Despite the happy ending of Crown of the Magister, war has still broken out between the Principality of Masgarth and the Kingdom of Galvan due to a high-profile assassination orchestrated by the Sorax, in which the ambassadors to the Legacy Council were poisoned at the end of the Crown of the Magister campaign. After the rift was closed by your party, many of the remaining Sorax on Solasta embedded themselves in the political hierarchy of Galvan and are masterminding this war from the shadows. The forces of Galvan are also invading the lands of the Snow Alliance, and Marshal Sunblaze believes that the insidious Sorax already have agents within the 5 clans of the Snow Alliance, spreading their malign influence in an attempt to take over from within. The threat of the Principality of Masgarth being surrounded on 2 fronts by Sorak puppet states is definitely not a good thing, and so the heroes of Solasta decide to investigate the matter by traveling to the northern lands of the Snow Alliance themselves, and hopefully unravel whatever villainous plot the Sorax have in store for your party. While making your way to the Snow Alliance, your party alongside the chief of the southern clans is ambushed by both Sorax and a new type of enemy not native to the world of Solasta, demons. The emergence of this new threat to Solasta seems to be related to an old tradition that the clans of the Snow Alliance practice, a custom known as the Pact of the Claw, where the chiefs of the Southern Clan, Central Clan, Northern Clan, Western Clan, and Eastern clans come together to elect a speaker that helps maintain the barrier between worlds. This revelation spurs on your party to uncover the secrets that the Snow Alliance holds. Throughout your journey in these frost-covered lands, the heroes of Solasta will have to delve into the politics of the Snow Alliance, and either make friends in high places, or gain enough leverage to push the reluctant clan chiefs to take part in the Pact of the Claw and elect a new speaker. This serves as the main hook to the Palace of Ice campaign, where the main quest plotline is broken down into 5 separate faction quests that center around each of the Snow Alliance's clans, and your party goes around solving each of their unique problems. Now, with the general story premise of the way, let's go over some of the interesting changes and ideas that I noticed Palace of Ice attempted to do that helps differentiate itself somewhat from the base game. The most notable difference between Crown of the Magister and Palace of Ice, at least for me, would be the way they structured the main quests, how they tried to bring the different factions into a more dynamic role in the actual story of the game, and how Palace of Ice basically didn't really have any side quests at all. Everything was contained within the 5 faction quest lines. The loss of side quests may sound kinda bad, but if I'm being completely honest, a lot of the side quests in Crown of the Magister was fairly boring. Most of them had the same fetch quest structure with a battle at the end, and didn't really feel that impactful besides being as a way to grind for extra loot and levels. So having less focus on side quests is not really that much of a downgrade for me, but it does dramatically reduce the overall playtime of the DLC, which may be a good or bad thing depending on what kind of player you are. Palace of Ice is a fairly short campaign experience, roughly 20 to 25 hours long, which is half of the Crown of the Magister campaign and even shorter than Lost Valley. But I would say that quality of gameplay often trumps quantity of time spent, and I think that if you're looking for a more condensed experience than what Crown of the Magister offered, then Palace of Ice sort of delivers on that aspect. The 5 main faction quests definitely feel like they had more time in the oven to bake than most of the quest lines found in Crown of the Magister. Palace of Ice gives the player the option to do any of the main faction quests in any order they desire, which is a nice improvement. The individual quest lines also offer the player a few options to actually impact the story of the campaign, mainly by choosing who your party sides with in each of the Snow Alliance's clan's internal politics. For example, you can choose to murder General Blunt and allow their treacherous subordinate to become the new clan chief in exchange for their vote for your candidate. You must step down. Oh no. Okay, yeah, here we go.
You are relieved of command, General.
Uh-oh.
What are you talking about?
Captain Ashdown will be a more reasonable clan
So
chief.
evil.
Damn traitor.
Yeah.
Gods!
Although unfortunately, this freedom of choice seems to be limited to 3 of the 5 major quest lines, with the Southern clans basically being an introduction story and the Northern clan quest line not really giving you much choice in the way things will go, except with the option of letting some dwarves freeze to death or not. However, despite its lack of length and a relatively narrow set of options to modify the outcome of the story, I would say that the quality of the dialogue and script of the story in Palace of Ice is a step above what the base game offered. All of the different clan factions actually do play a role in the overarching story of Palace of Ice. The major characters within those clans have different sets of problems, understandable motivations that drive them to do different things, and most of the story elements actually come together at the end of Palace of Ice. As a result, the overall experience is a lot more memorable than the often disconnected Crown of the Magister quest lines, where many of the side characters basically played no role whatsoever in the main story, and a lot of the world building also felt underutilized. With all of that being said though, there are definitely some flaws with the way the story mechanics of Palace of Ice is structured that made it feel less dynamic than what I felt the DLC could have been like. The main issue that I felt Palace of Ice's faction system suffer from would probably be the way that the party will eventually be in good standing with all of them, doing each and every one of their respective quests with no interplay between any of the clans, and the choices that you made previously. The relic system to gain more relationship points with the faction from Crown of the Magister has effectively been scrapped, and in its place is a much less interesting system where the clan that you choose to help out first will give you the highest relationship score, unlocking all of their merchant goods and giving you the highest discounts. All of the other factions will only reach the second highest relationship tier once you complete their faction quests. I think this was a rather severe downgrade from the Crown of the Magister system that forced you to prioritize one faction over the other using a finite resource of magical relics in order to access certain merchant options, but at the expense of locking away the higher tier items of other factions that you neglected. I didn't even know they married the idea of gaining relationship points directly to the main quest in the Palace of Ice campaign until like halfway through, when I realized there would be no way for me to improve my relationship with the other clans once I chose that first faction quest to complete. I felt that the merchant relic system in the Crown of the Magister campaign was a lot more refined, more elegant, and it gave players a sense of freedom in the way they interacted with the various factions of the hub city. Basically, the simplification of the way merchants worked in Palace of Ice felt like a regression that didn't need to happen, and it does feel like one of those areas where Solasta made 2 steps forward in terms of making the story feel less linear and having the factions be more important in the plot of the game, but with 1 step back in terms of mechanical flexibility of the faction merchant system compared to its predecessor. Another area where I felt Palace of Ice's faction design could have been a little bit more compelling for me would probably be the way that the different Snow Alliance clans didn't really interact with one another, and all of your choices only really impacted the election results at the very end of the game. I would have liked to have seen more consequences before the end of Palace of Ice, such as reactions or references to the decisions that the players made during their previous faction questline, and how that may change a character's opinion of your party or create a unique dialogue option only available because of the choices the player made during a previous previous faction quest. For example, in my playthrough, I betrayed the general of the Eastern clans. Maybe that will make some of the other clan leaders less trusting of my party's intentions, or maybe inspire other traitors to seek us out for help. Something like that would have been really cool to see. Now moving on from the quest design and faction system of Palace of Ice, I want to briefly go over my thoughts on some of the new mechanics that this DLC campaign brought to the table. The most obvious one would be the cold weather effects that acts as a debuff condition to creatures if the weather is cold and they have no source of heat nearby. It is a fairly thematic mechanic that was added in since the Snow Alliance, as the name would suggest, is very snowy and cold. However, the chilled and frozen negative conditions that Palace of Ice introduced was never really that impactful, and it didn't really change the tactical elements of Solasta that much. Palace of Ice does provide random flammable objects in the middle of the battlefield for your party to set ablaze in an attempt to get rid of the chilled or frozen conditions, but oftentimes it was not worth it to have a party member light something on fire and then have others huddled around the heat zone, since that would make your entire party a huge target for any form of area effect spell or ability, which unfortunately a lot of enemies in Palace of Ice seem to possess. The debuffs that being cold inflicted upon your party members were often annoying, but never so detrimental that it would influence the outcome of a battle, meaning that for my playthrough I more or less ignored it unless there was a convenient heat spot in a perfect location in the middle of a battlefield, which of course rarely happened. Another option that Palace of Ice gave the players to combat the effects of snowy weather were reworked magical items to give specific immunity to the chilled or frozen conditions. Things like Boots of the Winterland and Ring of Cold Resistance helped in this regard. But another design flaw of the way Palace of Ice implemented their weather effects is that many of these anti-freeze magical items oftentimes required attunement, and in true D&D 5th edition fashion, you can only have 3 attunement slots per character. This is a problem since at such high levels, you're already getting a ton of really good magical gear that also requires attunement. And so similarly to the heat zones in Palace of Ice, the dangers of being afflicted with the chilled or frozen conditions were vastly overshadowed by the prospect of having a much better magical item attuned to your character. There were so many powerful magical items, weapons, and armor that all competed for those precious attunement slots that the ability to avoid the chilled or frozen conditions felt more like an inconvenience tax than something to be fearful of, and therefore the items that are specifically designed to counter the cold weather oftentimes felt like inferior options in almost every scenario. Another thing that sort of irked me would be the name of the chilled condition, which is also the exact same name of the debuff that the chilled touch cantrip gives to enemies so that they can't regain hit points on their turn. I'm not sure why they couldn't have used a different name for the cold weather chilled condition in Palace of Ice, but that's like a small minor thing. The other notable new mechanic that Palace of Ice added to their campaign would be a new craftable set of consumables known as demonic grease. You get to craft demonic grease pretty early on by acquiring a new tool known as the abyssal agitator, and by collecting demonic essence as its main ingredient from the demons that you kill on your journey. All of the different demonic greases that you can choose to craft provide temporary effects that are pretty powerful and enhance your character's combat abilities quite drastically, but on the downside it also comes with a severe penalty that cripples you in some other way, making demonic greases a sort of double-edged sword. Demonic grease can give different sets of positive and negative effects depending on whether you apply the grease on your weapons or on your skin, which is an interesting design as it allows some degree of flexibility for a consumable. And overall, I think the new demonic grease consumables are a cool addition to Palace of Ice, as it gives the player new items to mess around with. Although I will say that sometimes I found myself feeling that the negative effects of using demonic grease were pretty debilitating, and the positive effects sometimes being overkill for most encounters, which sort of gave me the impression that demonic grease was not as useful as I had hoped, especially when compared to scrolls or potions that only had positive effects for your characters. Now moving on to another part of the Palace of Ice experience that I feel is important to mention would be the bugs, glitches, and parts of the game that created a rougher experience than I would have liked. I'm sure that most of these bugs and annoyances will eventually be ironed out in future patches or hotfixes, but they occurred with enough frequency in my playthrough that it did dampen my enjoyment of the Palace of Ice DLC a little bit, and should be noted down as something to watch out for if you're planning on buying Palace of Ice in the near future. For time reference, my playthrough began in May 2023 and ended in June of the same year. One of the first times I encountered something that frustrated me would be when my prismatic spray spell banished an enemy, and that may sound pretty cool at first because it's pretty rare, until you realize that the battle doesn't end if an enemy is banished. They are considered still alive and you will need to wait for the full 2-minute duration in order to actually end the battle. You're dead.
That I like.
So, I'm not sure why this person is banished. I really don't. Is this a bug that I encountered? Yeah, I don't know. Eliminate the bandits. Hopefully it's not a bug. I really hope it's not a bug. Duration 1 minute? Just to wait for her to pop up again? Okay. It's gonna be a long wait then. For people who don't know, every round is considered 6 seconds of time passed in both Solasta and D&D, which means 20 rounds need to be passed for the banished person to pop up again. At that point, it's probably faster to just reload and try again. There is no way to shorten or end the banished condition on the enemy since Prismatic Spray is not a concentration spell, and actually in tabletop Dungeons & Dragons, Prismatic Spray actually permanently banishes an enemy, and there is no time limit, which is why it's kind of strange that Solasta implemented a duration. I assume it's some sort of oversight or perhaps a limitation of the game. I would classify this problem more as a missing feature rather than a true bug, because what Solasta should do is treat the banished character as dead, or implement a feature that allows you to end the banishment early. Another technical issue that I ran into would be that sometimes one of my party members would freeze up and stop moving when they get near a heat zone that gives off the warm condition. This usually happens in the middle of a movement order and causes the entire game to not be able to move ahead with the rest of the turn, and forcing the player to just stare and not be able to do anything besides reload a previous save file. And dash with you over here, little quackers. He's warm. Wait, what? Oh my god, I'm stuck. No, Solasta. Oh, I'm stuck. Solasta, please. Solasta, come on. Move. Move. Ah, damn you. How do you have... Why? No, why is this bug oh my god. Why does little quackers get stuck on this warm spot? The game itself is not entirely frozen. I'm still able to move the camera and access the menu, but the locked character never fixes itself. I waited 15 minutes for the game to process, because Solasta does often have times when the game takes a moment to calculate certain actions, but nothing ever changes this time, so that's why this bug deserved to be mentioned. For whatever reason, this problem only ever occurred with my wizard character and none of my other party members, which is why it baffled me so much. Another noteworthy technical problem that I ran into would be at the end of the game, when you are at the actual Palace of Ice location and when you defeat Sephiroth a second time. There is supposed to be blue rectangles marking the area where your party needs to stand on in order to be teleported to another location, but for whatever reason, even after I defeated the boss, these teleporter spots never reappeared. Oh, what? That's weird. Wait, why doesn't it... hold on. Why doesn't the portal show up? Why did it disappear? Oh shit. Yes. Yes! Okay, I beat Sephiroth for a second time now. And now I think the pillar, yes, thank you. That little opening is here now. Okay, that's weird. And so I was basically trapped with no way of making progress and had to reload a previous save file and fight Sephiroth again in order to make the blue rectangles appear this time. There were also a few other examples of bugs that occurred in my playthrough, such as using the teleporter to go to the Ruins of Dilemma, but that apparently causes you to skip an important flag in the main quest, which will trap you inside a library with no way of getting out. But the other technical glitches that I encountered were less rage-inducing than the 3 that I highlighted. Again, in the grand scheme of things, what I mentioned as problems are probably going to get fixed anyways, and by the time this video is published, some of these issues probably have already been patched out, though I feel it is important to talk about the somewhat flawed state Palace of Ice began with. But moving away from technical game bugs, there were also a few missing features in Palace of Ice that kinda threw me off. One of the things that happens whenever you finish a main story quest with each of the clans is that Marshal Sunblaze sends your party a letter. Once you've received the letter, one of your party members always talks about how they should write a message back to Sunblaze to inform him about your adventure. It is implied that your party does this off screen and is in fact an automatic process by the game because Marshal Sunblaze always seems informed and up to date with what has transpired. But it's one of those small things where it would have been cooler if the game actually had a mechanic that allowed you to selectively inform Marshal Sunblaze of your activities in the Snow Alliance, especially since one of your party members constantly talks about writing a message back, which really confused me at first since I thought the game was hinting that there was a specific mechanic that I was somehow missing out on, but apparently it was just fluff to remind the player that the party is automatically writing letters to Marshal Sunblaze to keep him up to date. Another missing feature that really shocked me would be the fact that Palace of Ice does not have a party stash where you can store away your items in a safe chest. This was doubly disappointing for me since I had a lot of really useful loot stored away in the party stash back during the Crown of the Magister campaign, and thought that when importing my save file I would eventually get access to all the items that I put away in the chest. But apparently this was never meant to be. The lack of storage was also kind of rough during the Palace of Ice campaign specifically, since they showered you with a lot of unique magical items, but with no way to safely store them. You had to either deal with a heavier encumbrance load or simply sell all the new stuff they gave to your party in order to free up some weight. I'm not sure why Palace of Ice currently does not have a party stash. It really was a handy feature in the game that had a limited amount of weight a character can carry, and it sort of made the importing of the Crown of the Magister save file feel incomplete since it didn't transfer over a large stash of items picked up over the course of the previous campaign. Another area in which the importing of the Crown of the Magister save files felt not as comprehensive as it should have been would probably be the way it tries to give callbacks to previous choices that your party has made. In my Crown of the Magister playthrough, I accidentally got a soldier by the name of Lisbeth Townsend killed pretty early on.
You've got some explaining to do.
Daliat was hiding this from you.
That's probably why they attacked.
He refused to let it go, despite the danger.
I'm not surprised.
That's it? So when it's your turn to be killed, I should just say that?
Lisbeth!
Oh, what the? Where'd that guy come from? Oh, that's unfortunate. But for some reason, in Palace of Ice, Lisbeth is alive and well. You wanna stop freezing
Lisbeth? Is that you?
for me? Get a fire?
Damn. Can't say if seeing you is good news or the opposite.
This makes me feel that the actions that I undertook in the previous campaign have not carried over to the sequel properly. Instead, Palace of Ice simply pre-generates a template set of most likely outcomes, and if that is the case, then that sort of defeats the purpose of importing your save files to begin with, causing a bit of damage to the overall continuity and immersion of the story. This might seem like a fairly small thing to complain about, but Palace of Ice has very few moments where it tries to recall the actions that a player took in their Crown of the Magister run, so it was fairly astounding that one of the few times that they tried to tie in the Palace of Ice DLC with its predecessor, they mess it up. I think the DLC would have benefited if the tie-ins to the base game were better constructed and more seamless, and is one of the features that I feel like should have gotten more attention. The final aspect that I want to talk about will be related to story elements that come later in the game, and will contain some spoilers for the plot of Palace of Ice. So if you want to remain unspoiled on the story, then please feel free to skip towards the conclusion segment of the video. I would say that one of the biggest bummers of the story in Palace of Ice would probably be the way that the old merchant factions didn't really make much of an appearance at all, with the minor exception of the Arcaneum with Headlong Surespell. This was rather strange to me since the start of the Palace of Ice campaign, they mentioned the Antiquarians and Hallman Summer, the guy who tried to kill your party as they were sleeping in Cairgiflin at the end of the Crown of Magister campaign. So I thought they were setting up for some kind of final confrontation with the traitors from the Antiquarian faction, but from then on, after the beginning, there was no other mention of Hallman Summer or the Sorak cultists throughout the rest of the campaign, so I think this was a big missed opportunity to give closure to that particular story arc from that first campaign and a waste of recognizable antagonists. Another element of the story that I found wanting was the campaign's lack of involvement with the war against the Kingdom of Galvan. We only really get this secondhand knowledge of the way the frontline battles are going from Marshal Sunblaze's letters, which is a real shame. The story built up the war with Galvan as the major event happening in Solasta at the moment, and also as a loose end of the Sorak invasion plotline. So not really being able to interact with the war directly felt like another missed opportunity to push the content of the DLC in a cool direction. For example, unifying the Snow Alliance and convincing all of the clans to join with the Principality of Mascarth to fight back against the forces of Galvan. I think that would have been pretty cool. Another strange oddity of Palace of Ice's storyline would be the lack of explanation as to why the demons are in alignment with the Soraks. Like, yeah, I understand that they are both chaotic evil outsiders, but what does Sethroth, the demon leader, gain from letting Sortar control a world? What do the demons gain from helping the Soraks conquer Solasta? If the demons also want to eventually conquer Solasta, wouldn't that be a conflict of interest with the Soraks? The goals and motivations of Sethroth, the Archreaver, is never explained, and that really weakens a villain's ability to resonate with the player because it makes them feel like a one-dimensional sock puppet with no real personality other than to be an antagonist of the story. A further issue with the plot of Palace of Ice would be the way everything resolves at the gate within the demonic plane at the very end of the DLC. There was this character that popped out of nowhere called the Gatekeeper, and it told us that in order for the gate to open back up, we would need to sacrifice a person's soul. And this naturally leads to many more questions, such as who is the Gatekeeper? Why did the Gatekeeper decide to inform us on how to use the gate? And why does the gate cost a soul when entering Solasta, but is apparently free to use when going going into the demon world? How did all of the lesser demons get into Solasta in the first place if it requires a mortal soul to operate the gateway from within the Palace of Ice? How did everybody in the Snow Alliance forget about the true purpose of the Pact of the Claw, which is to elect someone to maintain the barrier between Solasta and the demon realm, especially since the Western clan is governed by an elf who apparently was alive during the reign of the Manichaean Empire and survived the Cataclysm? And all of these plot holes sort of nibble away at the integrity of the story and undermines the ending the Palace of Ice was trying to deliver. But despite all of my naysaying, I do genuinely believe that Palace of Ice was an overall good experience, especially for someone who already enjoyed the base game content. I think that a lot of the problems I had with the game were impacting areas that were never Solasta's strong suit to begin with. I would have liked it more if Palace of Ice launched in a more polished state, but I do have faith that the developers will fix a lot of the issues that I ran into over time. So my concluding thoughts for the Palace of Ice DLC is that if you really wanted some form of sequel or a sense of closure to the Crown of the Magister campaign, where you can end the journey you began with your old party, and if you want a shorter, more concise Solasta experience of only 20+ hours, then Palace of Ice is a decent choice for you to pick up. And as always, I hope that anyone who watches my stuff enjoys what I create as much as I enjoyed creating it in the first place. I'll see you guys next time, but until then, goodbye for now.